Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to our webinar, Enterprise Cloud Strategies, Best Practices for Cloud Proofs of Concept. Today's webinar covers how to select an application and a cloud for your POC, what technical hurdles to expect and how to overcome them, and how to evaluate whether your cloud POC was successful. I'd like to introduce our speakers today. I have with me Kim Wines. She's the Vice President of Marketing at RightScale. Kim began her career in engineering, and she has spent the last 20 years helping enterprises leverage new transformational technologies. And in the last 4 years, she's been focusing on solutions that can help enterprises adopt cloud computing. I also have with me Vijay Talwani. He's a cloud solutions engineer at RightScale. Vijay's been with us for 2 years. Prior to joining RightScale, he's with Cisco, acting as a data center architect, and there he helped customers to architect their virtualized data centers. He's seen both the cloud paradigm as well as the conventional paradigm, and at RightScale, he helps customers through that transition. One of the many great things about GoToWebinar I'd like to point out is the questions section. So check it out in the main GoToWebinar control panel. We're standing by to answer your questions as they come in. Plus, throughout the course of the webinar, Kim and Vijay will address some of the questions that are more broadly applicable to the webinar attendees at large, and then we'll answer those live on the air. So make sure to ask your questions early and often. I'd also like to point out the hashtag for this webinar is #RightScale. So join the webinar conversation on Twitter. And with that, I'll hand it off to Kim.
Thanks, Sarah, and welcome everybody. I'm excited to talk with you a little bit today about enterprise cloud POCs and what companies are doing to test out and get familiar with cloud technologies. So our agenda today, I'll just spend a few seconds at the beginning for those of you that might not know RightScale, giving a little bit of quick background on who we are, just so it tells you a little bit about our perspective and where we come from and sort of how we come at this issue of cloud adoption and cloud POCs. Then we'll talk about cloud POCs, do's and don'ts. We've had the opportunity to work with and talk to lots of enterprises that are doing cloud POCs, and we have some interesting recommendations and insights that I think might be helpful. And then Vijay will take over and talk about how you choose the right cloud to use for your POC, as well as navigating any technical hurdles. And then I'll wrap up with measuring the success of your POC. What kind of metrics should you be looking at to see if cloud is something that's right for you? So let's just give you a little bit of background on RightScale. So RightScale, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, is the leader in cloud management. We've launched almost 5 million servers through our cloud management platform. Those are being launched by our customers into both public and private cloud environments. And in fact, you'll see in this big chart with all the nice colors that includes companies that are using just a single cloud. The gray area is companies that are launching into multiple different public clouds. And the green area, which has grown to be the largest over the last year, is companies that are leveraging hybrid cloud, meaning they have some of their workloads in public clouds and some in private clouds. We've probably worked with more customers on more clouds than anybody you'll talk about there in the industry, so we have a lot of insights. We do have over 12 public and private cloud providers that we partner with and that our platform integrates to. So we've seen a lot of different cloud provider options, and we've have customers that are working with deployments that are as large as tens of thousands of servers. But we also work with companies that are just getting going, that are just deploying a handful of servers into cloud environments. The one other piece that I'll share with you is just a little bit about some of the customers that we do work with, and these range across a wide spectrum of industries. You'll see that obviously there are some industries that are really going first into the cloud as early adopters, but we are seeing that that's really expanded, and now we're seeing a lot of traditional enterprises in a variety of different sectors that are trying to figure out how the cloud can help them with their business. So that's the brief RightScale commercial. So with that, let's just shift to our topic for the day, which is cloud POCs. And so POC, I think we all know, means proof of concept. And the big question is, why are companies deciding to proceed with POCs? And I think the thing that we've seen over the past few years is that business expectations are changing. And part of that has come about with the the onslaught of the public cloud. So as we've seen the public cloud start to come into our consciousness as a great IT alternative, it's also set some standards that businesses are looking to and asking their IT organizations to deliver on. And so those standards are things like instant on. I want to be able to use this immediately. I want to be able to get self-service access to the types of technologies that I need to run my business or my organization or my application. And we're starting to see those applications morph into things that have much larger scale. As we look at things like mobile apps and social programs and big data and the scalability of many web applications, we're starting to see a whole new level of scale that we need to think about. And so those are reasons that are driving people to the public and private cloud, and those are reasons why many companies today are doing POCs. So let's talk a little bit about some of the do's and don'ts of doing a POC in the cloud. And so the first thing we'll do is I want to talk about a few cloud POC mantras. And our first mantra, and probably the most important one, is picking the right application. And cloud is a fit for everyone at some point, but it's not a fit for every application. So almost every company, I don't think we've encountered one yet that doesn't have some application that would be a good fit for cloud. But for example, your ERP application might not be the first application that you choose to deploy in the cloud. So when you think about doing your cloud POC, let's talk about how you might go about picking the best application. So the first thing that we recommend is really making it real. Don't come up with like a fake application, but find a real application for a real project that has real expectations. Because obviously if you just make up some fake application or you try to cobble together a hello world type of application, that may be a great way to just start the first step of your POC. But what you really want is an application that's going to give you a real use case. But again, don't start with the hardest use case. So don't think, let me pick the most sophisticated, most complex application that I can and see if the cloud can do that. Instead, think about applications that are a good fit with the cloud. So some of the things I mentioned before, web apps, mobile, social, collaboration, big data, batch processing, dev test. These are many of the types of use cases that we're seeing go onto the cloud in the time frame of cloud adoption that we sit today, which is probably, if we look at the scheme of things over the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we're just really in the early days of cloud adoption. So find something that's a good fit, that's something that you really could get value by deploying it into the cloud. You could get value by getting deployment out there quicker, making it more scalable, dealing with variable loads, lowering costs, whatever those might be. Also, think about the security and compliance profile. So while I think some of the security concerns about the cloud are overblown, there are some limitations, especially on the compliance side of things that you can do in the cloud. So instead of thinking about the most secure, the classified application, think about things that are user-facing, customer-facing, that have low to moderate security requirements so that you can get your feet wet and start to learn about how you do secure your applications in the cloud. So the second mantra that we want to talk about is picking the right approach. And if you've ever rock climbed before, you know, whether you've been outside or in a rock climbing gym, you know the most important thing is to pick the right route, take the right approach to find the biggest handholds, the biggest footholds that you can get. And so you want to take that same approach with the cloud. Don't pick the hardest route, pick the approach that's going to get you there easiest. And also think of it as a learning experience, not something that you do it lasts a month or 2 months or 3 months and then you're done, but as something that you're going to use as your first foray into the cloud. Based on that, you're going to learn some lessons out of that, and now you're going to go back and improve, whether with that application or with another application in the future. So let's talk about the right approach. So we talked about keeping it lightweight and starting simple, not starting with the most complex thing, but making it real. But also think about time frame. You don't need to make this take forever. This can be a 30 to 60 day time period. So within 30 to 60 days, you should be able to complete this cloud POC. The second thing to think about is don't try to make this your data center. So don't try to look at everything that you've developed in your data center and then try to turn the cloud into everything that your data center is. Instead, think about the value that cloud provides, the approach that it takes, the architectures that fit well with the cloud, and then take that architecture, take that direction, take that approach. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. We talked about treating it as a learning experience, so not once and done. Keep in mind that your cloud deployments will evolve. So, for example, what you do on day one with your cloud deployment, as that application scales and improves and expands, you may need to do new things. Take it to scale it up larger. Think about how you're going to do failover and disaster recovery, take it to new geographies. So keep in mind that this can evolve over time. And probably most importantly is your expertise and knowledge are going to change too. The first time you do something in the cloud, you're going to experience some things that are a little bit different than your frame of reference in the data center or internal applications, or even potentially at your hosting providers. So be prepared for that. Treat this as a way to get familiar with all the ins and outs of cloud, and that's a great approach for your POC. The other thing is keep in mind that if this is going to evolve over time and this is not a once and done, think from the beginning, how are you going to manage this over time? So we do provide a cloud management platform that you can use to help deploy and manage over time. So you're going to need to think about ways to do that in your situation. So with that, let's see if I've got my next slide here. I'm going to turn it over to VJ, and he's going to talk with you a little bit about how to choose the right cloud for your POC.
Thank you much, Kim. When you're going about building a proof of concept for your own cloud environments, one of the things that we come across over and over again is really folks looking and wanting to actually build their private cloud. And they start out saying, hey, I want to have a POC and I want to jump immediately into the realm of building a private cloud. And when they do that, there are often very specific and very valid use cases for why they go about building a private cloud. A couple I've highlighted here are they really want the performance and flexibility of building things and building out the infrastructure with the specific needs of their application in mind. They also oftentimes prefer a CapEx procurement model as opposed to the OpEx of the public cloud, or they have security and compliance reasons as to why the private cloud really is a better fit for them with their particular applications and their particular environment. Now, all of those are very, very good use cases for private clouds, and that makes very good sense, and we see a lot of success there. But when we're going about beginning a proof of concept, I think it's very important to understand that there are oftentimes public clouds out there that are using the very same technologies that you would use to build a private cloud. I listed a few here as an example of looking at two of the technologies where we've seen a lot of success with OpenStack and CloudStack, and that there are a number of publicly available cloud providers that are using those very same orchestration technologies and very same hypervisors that you would use in your private cloud. But what this offers you is now you have the ability to go out and really leverage the agility of a public cloud. And instead of waiting and going through the process of building your entire private cloud, you can start dabbling in the public cloud, seeing that your applications function in a cloud architecture running on the same orchestration technologies in parallel with you actually building your private cloud. So if you look at cloud, it's really all about enabling agility, and this sort of a model really helps you get that to a new level where you can start testing on cloud architecture before you've even built your cloud. Next slide, please. Now, when you go through this process, what we've seen many folks fall into the trap of is thinking about the complete end goal in mind and thinking about every little piece that it's going to take to get to that end goal. So I'll use an analogy here of, hey, we know exactly what we want to accomplish, but we fall into this trap of saying, hey, using this old analogy of, hey, it's a marathon and it's not a sprint. And you go and you get so excited about it and you jump straight into saying, oh, well, I want to tie it into my existing ITSM systems and it needs to be PCI compliant and I have HIPAA compliance and I have all of these various things that are very real requirements for this cloud project to really be successful within my organization. And you start thinking about all of those things and let yourself get bogged down in the process of thinking about all of those various things. What I would encourage you to do is take a very different approach and really focus on agility. And start with something small, show that it works, really start to learn about cloud, and then work from there. Work from something simple, work from a lightweight application, maybe something public-facing, a web app, that would have been something that you maybe started out when you made the transition from physical servers to virtualized servers. Start with that low-hanging fruit, learn about cloud, see some success with it, and then start working from there into more and more complex workloads. Next slide, please. Now, as we start to enable more and more complex workloads, I think it's very important that we look at the cloud with a specific lens and that we really think of it as an augmentation to anything that we've normally been doing within our existing IT processes. Cloud isn't this radical transformation that completely changes everything about IT. It's really yet another service offering that we can now offer to the business. And these cloud architectures are fundamentally different. Many times we start thinking about a virtual machine as a virtual machine, and we think of a cloud really as virtual machines in the sky. But when you start to actually look at the architecture of a HA application running in the cloud, they're often built very, very different. And that you think of historically, we've really used a bottoms-up infrastructure-focused sort of an architecture. And that we had very, very resilient hardware. We had built very feature-rich hypervisors on top of that, and maybe we've dabbled in some orchestration on top of that, but really the intelligence was down in that underlying hardware. We threw very, very high-performing hardware at our applications and had very little logic up at the higher levels of the stack. What we're seeing in cloud architectures is that we're fundamentally changing that paradigm. And that oftentimes we're leveraging commodity hardware and commodity hypervisors, and we're adding on top of that a level of automation that we've never seen before. And this is really allowing us to achieve highly available and scalable architectures with a little bit of a different approach. Now, I'll use an example here of how we would scale databases. In that historically, most people have really built monolithic SQL databases, and as they needed more and more performance, they effectively threw hardware at the problem. And they threw more and more resources at it, and they ended up with this database that oftentimes didn't even make that transition from physical to virtual because its requirements were so extreme. What we've seen on the cloud is it's forced us to take a more intelligent approach there, in that instead of just throwing more and more hardware resources at it, we took the commodity ephemeral resources that were available in the cloud and started to build architectures where we leverage things like sharding or caching or NoSQL, and started to leverage those more advanced database technologies, and we could oftentimes achieve higher performance levels at a lower cost, and we were at a more fault-tolerant architecture than we would ever be able to accomplish had we just used more and more higher-performing hardware. Next slide, please. Now, after you've gone through that process of building out your application to run on a cloud architecture, and then you've brought that back in-house and tested out on a private cloud, now what you can do is start to look and say, all right, I'm running this application and I'm running it on my target private cloud, and now I can start testing from some of those things I was concerned about early on. Now I can start testing the specific performance level that this cloud is going to offer me. Now I can start looking and saying if I'm going to be able to achieve the security and compliance requirements that running this application in production will actually require. And then I can start thinking about my existing ITSM processes, my existing systems, how I handle ticketing, how I handle service catalogs, request routing. all of those things become relevant now that I've seen that my application can run on a public cloud. I've shown that it can run on a private cloud, and now I can start evaluating more and more complex applications and more complex workloads and continue bringing those things in. But it's very important to consider these goals as secondary goals. If I started out with these things in mind and I focused so much on achieving my security and compliance requirements and my integration with ITSM processes, I got bogged down in that and only to find out that, hey, this application didn't even run on a cloud architecture to begin with. So it's very important to start out on that public cloud, show that the application runs on a cloud architecture, and then start getting into these more advanced tests and techniques here. Next slide, please. Now, when we go through this process and we're really looking at the specific performance requirements, there are a number of pitfalls that we've seen that people run into over and over that we want to just highlight for you so you're aware of some of the things you may come across. But by far and away from a performance perspective, the biggest challenge that we've seen on cloud architectures is oftentimes the underlying storage subsystems aren't going to give you the same level of performance that you may be used to with your existing SANs and a high-performance SAN environment. And what we've done here is oftentimes leveraged the architectures that we talked about earlier of striping, sharding, and NoSQL as really a way to take that underlying storage and still achieve that high performance level that our applications require, even though the infrastructure is ultimately a lower performing infrastructure. The other thing that we see oftentimes is within our own data centers, we often relied on shared storage. And clouds tend to not give us that same capability of actually being able to mount a volume onto multiple servers at the same time. We've been able to get around this limitation by leveraging technologies like OpenNFS to actually leverage cloud instances and bring those up as NFS filers, now giving us this shared storage on a cloud, even though it wasn't an inherent offering by the public cloud themselves. The other challenge that we come across is really the challenge of licensing, in that oftentimes our software is licensed by things like physical CPU cores or a number of hosts that we're running. And in a cloud, we tend to not have that level of flexibility, and that licensing model isn't quite as pertinent there. RightScale is actually helping you solve this problem through our multi-cloud marketplace and our relationship with a number of independent software vendors, in that they actually will publish server templates into the RightScale marketplace. And for those of you who may not be familiar with a server template, it's effectively a blueprint of a server that automates the process of spinning up that server on a cloud architecture. And within that server template, it'll actually incorporate the licensing for these ISV software. So now you have a licensing model that'll be based on the instance and an hourly model that makes sense within a cloud architecture, and you can leverage the licensing that RightScale has negotiated on your behalf within the multi-cloud marketplace. Really, the fourth element here is the network flexibility, in that oftentimes inside of our data centers, we're used to being able to have full control over the network itself, in that we could control exactly what IP addresses were assigned to each of the virtual machines or physical hosts in our data center. In a cloud architecture, oftentimes these IP addresses are assigned by DHCP, and we don't have that level of flexibility. We've been able to work around that by oftentimes leveraging dynamic DNS and flipping to a model where we're really looking at host names. And even though the underlying IP addresses may be unknown, we always know that we can resolve a particular host name, and it'll always bring us to that specific server. And the last challenge here is really the one of security and compliance. And when you get to taking on this challenge, what I would encourage you to do is think about the most hostile environment. Take your application that requires PCI compliance and think about how you could architect that application to run in a public cloud. Things like disk encryption and and transmitting our data over a VPN tunnel so it's secured both in transit and at rest are absolutely best practices. And if you design for the public cloud and design an architecture that will be secure and compliant in the public cloud, you know that you can move it to a less stringent environment, perhaps behind your private cloud, and you're still going to be able to achieve those security and compliance requirements of the application itself. Next slide, please. So now that we've talked about a number of the technical characteristics of choosing a cloud and evaluating the performance characteristics and given you a methodology of starting with the public cloud, then evolving to the private cloud and more complex workloads, and talked about some of the technical pitfalls you could come across, I'm going to turn it back over to Kim to talk about how you can evaluate your POC and really put the right metrics in place so that you know that your proof of concept itself has been a success or whether you should consider taking a different path.
Thanks, VJ. So we're going to talk about the last cloud POC mantra, which is picking the right metrics. And I think the way to think about this is begin your cloud journey with the end in mind. So there's a lot of different reasons why companies are considering using cloud computing. And that's kind of big picture benefits, and we're going to talk about a few of those in a moment. But let's take those same big picture benefits that you're hoping to achieve and applying them to the cloud POC. I think sometimes with the POC, it's easy to just get caught up in a few sort of easy things to track and not really think about that big picture benefit that you're ultimately trying to achieve. So what are some of these metrics that we might be looking at? So one of the most common metrics that we hear in all the surveys that get done about usage of the cloud and the benefits that companies hope to get is business agility. And business agility I just define as how quickly can the cloud help us respond to business needs and opportunities. So in our businesses all the time we have business units that see a new product they could offer or a new service or a new way to interact with our customers or a new way to interact with our partners or maybe a new way to manage internal processes. And those demands often entail putting in place software and systems to help support those new ideas and those new opportunities. And as we know that it takes time to put in place those new systems and those new pieces of software. Often there's more to do on the list than we can actually complete in an IT organization. And so we have to prioritize, and that means that it can take a while to deliver all of those business requirements that we're getting asked for. And the important thing to think about here is often these options have a market window, meaning if we wait too long, we lose out to competitors or we lose our first mover advantage or it becomes a moot point. And so timing of delivering those business requirements is often just as important as actually delivering those requirements. And when we have processes internally that can take a while to go through approvals, to provision hardware, to get everything set up and develop applications, when we can't meet the requirements of the business, often what we get then is shadow IT. So we get businesses going around IT, spinning up their own applications, going to SaaS providers, going to service providers, going to outside developers. And while that can meet the needs of the business, that can also sometimes have further impacts to the IT organization down the line. So if business agility is one of the key important aspects for your company in using cloud, some of the things that you may want to evaluate in your cloud POC is really looking at how quick and easy is it to launch new applications or services. So when somebody makes a request, how long does it take to get that up? And what about changes to that when they need to update it or change it? And then you could also have varying demands. So you may have applications that need to scale up. I'm in marketing, and those of us in marketing are really notorious for this, is asking IT for help in things that may need to scale to very large volumes to meet customer demand of a promotion or a campaign. But also we may need to scale those down over time if the demand is not what we expected or if there's peaks in traffic or usage. So that's one of the things that you may want to look at as part of your POC. Also new geographies. So often when we start off with something new, we bring it out in a single geography to begin with, and then we want to expand it over time. So in your cloud POC, evaluate what's that going to take to go from geography number 1 to geography number 2. What is that going to look like? The second is really self-service. So that's one of those business imperatives that seems to be becoming more and more important, where our business units or business groups or application teams want the ability to go to a portal and push a button and get something to run. And that might be a development environment for development or a test environment. For the marketing team, that could be a new blog property. It could be a collaboration tool that gets used internally. We call this concept at RightScale the IT vending machine. So the idea I can go and look at the vending machine, see a set of options that I have, and push the button and make that happen and get my application or my environment. And then the last part is thinking about automation. Because for the first application, your POC, there may not be a lot of maintenance right away. And so this might be something that you overlook. But once that application is deployed, there's going to be a lot of things that need to go on. You need to monitor that, make sure there's no issues, get alerted if there's issues, automate updates. There's a whole set of things to deal with this on an ongoing basis, not just get it up and running the first time basis. And so automation is going to be an important piece of your cloud POC. So let's talk about a second success metric, and this is probably one that we also see most commonly on surveys about why people want to use the cloud, and those are really around efficiency. And that could be around cost efficiency, that maybe there's some cost savings that go on, or it could be around time efficiency. I want to reduce the amount of effort that it takes for my IT group to have to manage this so that we can accomplish more of our business objectives and not have to spend so much time on all of that routine work. So if this is something that's important to you as a company, your evaluation criteria are going to look at things like costs. So one of the things that you might look at there is data center costs versus cloud costs. So this is kind of an interesting question, because one thing that the public cloud has really done is make very transparent the costs of running an application, or at least the infrastructure portions of that. The cost of the hardware and the networking and the data storage and the access and the cooling and the electricity and all of the things that it takes to keep a set of infrastructure up and running to support a particular application. So we can go online, for example, to any of the public cloud providers and probably see their price list and how many cents per hour depending on the size of the server. But in our data center, that data is maybe not quite as transparent for most of us. While there are some companies that do some chargebacks of certain portions of the costs, it's not that common for us to be able to fully understand the loaded costs of our data center. So doing this evaluation is going to require you to take a little bit of an apples to apples look at it, because you have to look at what are all the relevant costs in the data center that would be replaced by those cloud costs. And then also, how does this impact my headcount and my efficiency? If I'm running in the cloud, can I be more efficient with my sysadmins, or am I going to be less efficient than in my data center? What tools am I maybe going to be applying that I need to consider? So looking at all of the aspects that roll up into that are important. The second is really how we spend the money. This can be very important to your company depending on their financial model and how your company is structured, of whether we care more about capital expenses or operating expenses. So for some companies, they prefer capital investments, meaning buying hardware up front, for example, putting a private cloud in place, and then running that over time and depreciating it. But we're seeing more and more companies these days that are interested in turning that into an operating expense. And what that means is that you pay as you go. You pay for it on some type of a per usage basis. With the public cloud, that becomes much easier, because that's how the public cloud providers are typically charging. But even for those of you thinking about a private cloud, many companies are looking at simulating that type of operating expense by charging back to their business units who are taking advantage of that technology and of that resource. The third thing to think about is kind of the soft angle to this, which is really the opportunity cost. So if I use cloud, does it open up new opportunities that maybe I'm losing if I don't have that as an option in my portfolio? And then the second piece of this, we talked about efficiency of cost. It's also efficiency of time. How much time does it take for your IT team or your development team to go through all of the processes to prepare your applications and deploy them into a data center environment? How does that change in a cloud environment? Does that get better? Does it maybe take longer? What do those processes look like? How long does the actual deployment take? I know that often you have to wait in an IT environment, sometimes like 3 to 6 months from a request to actually have something you can run your application on. Whereas what does that look like in a cloud environment? We had one customer, for example, they were deploying a software application that they sold, and they would deploy it for individual customers. So think of it like a single tenanted SaaS application. And this company, when they were deploying it in a data center environment, it would often take them months to get a new customer up and running. They were able to take that by using cloud and cloud management down to a matter of a few days. So think about what opportunity that might have opened up for their sales team to sell to customers who have very tight deadlines, to get them up and running quickly and be able to go on to the next deal. So just another example of how time can help you. And then also think not just about getting the application up and running, but that ongoing management. What does that look like? What kinds of tools and management platforms do you need in place in the cloud to manage that? And how does that compare maybe to your experiences in the data center environment? So one last success metric is really just better solutions. So can you, using the cloud, do things that maybe just weren't even possible before or weren't practical before? So are there things that we can do that were sort of out of the range of possibility, either because of the hardware required or the cost or the time or the resource? So if you think about that, you might think about what types of new solutions were difficult before. VJ talked a little bit earlier about big data. Big data, kind of came onto the scene when companies like Yahoo and Facebook that had these vast volumes of unstructured data had to figure out ways to deal with it. So they developed things like NoSQL databases to help manage that data. I think what's happened since then is we've realized that big data exists in almost every industry. I know that with RightScale, we're not a huge enterprise, but we have vast volumes of web visit data and web tracking data and marketing data and sales data about all of our interactions with customers that amounts to a very big volume. So most companies today are seeing that they have applications that are kind of wrapped around big data. Those were types of things that, although may be possible to do in a data center environment, could often be prohibitively expensive to do in a data center environment. And so cloud might be a great option there. Batch processing is another example of things that companies do, but often at a very high cost. Now they can move that into the cloud, have their usage be metered, so they're paying during those big peaks in load, and they're not paying when they're not doing those batches. But also just brand new things that didn't exist 10 years ago. Almost every company today has a mobile application of some sort. Companies that you wouldn't expect, from insurance companies to automobile companies to consumer electronics companies, have mobile apps that you can use. Mobile apps means you may have a lot of users. You may be dealing with a lot of scale. You have to let people access from different geographies. Something that might be possible in a data center environment, but certainly difficult and possibly very expensive. Social is becoming something that's more important for every company. We're creating social applications, social ways to interact with our customers, with our partners, with our employees. So these are just examples of solutions that maybe either didn't exist or were difficult before that can now be enabled by using the cloud. The second angle is to look at, can I support not new solutions, but better solutions? So we talked about scalability a little bit. So for example, in marketing, we'll often run campaigns, and those campaigns could be very popular or they could be a flop. If I have an internal data center, I'm provisioning hardware to support that. Maybe I'm doing a microsite or a campaign site or some type of a online solution to that. I have to provision hoping it's going to do well, which then costs me money that I didn't need to spend if it doesn't perform quite as well. On the converse, let's say it goes past my wildest expectations. I didn't provision for that. Suddenly, I have a bad user experience. We had an example of a customer has a consumer product that they sell to around Christmas time, and they had an online application that went along with this product that they sold that you could interact with along with the product. What they found as they rolled it out is that their data center resources that they thought were going to be enough actually weren't enough, and it started to impact the user experience. They had a very bad user experience. So they quickly looked at cloud, were able to move that application to the cloud, and now scale up and down to meet that demand. The second example is geographic availability. So as we talked about, it can be very difficult to make things available in multiple geographies when you're running in a data center. To reduce the latency that can exist when you're traveling over long distance of the internet, you may need to run that application multiple different geographic regions. That can be very, very easy to do in a cloud environment because most clouds have multiple regions, or if your particular cloud provider doesn't have multiple regions, there's often another complementary provider you can use in a different region. And then the last part is thinking about high availability. I think a great example of this recently is just that we had that Hurricane Sandy come through. And maybe some of you saw the pictures in the news of people in lower Manhattan where there was all the flooding, carrying the gasoline upstairs to their data centers to keep the generators running that were powering their servers, that were keeping their critical systems and their websites up. And so it's something that often we hear about cloud outages, but this is like the opposite example. It shows that even traditional data centers can be impacted. And so we saw in the case of Sandy, there were actually some customers that used cloud as their backup disaster recovery from their traditional data center. And they were able to offload onto cloud infrastructures and keep things up and running. So this is another potential way you can create better solutions using the cloud. So just let's wrap up, and then we want to open it up. We have a few questions coming in so that we can start to answer some of those questions. So start with an application, a real application that's a good fit for cloud. Treat it as a learning experience. You're not going to just do this for a month and then put it away on the shelf, but this real application is going to live over time. You're going to improve it, expand what you're doing, and add new applications over time. Think about public cloud as a feasibility mechanism before you get to private cloud. As Vijay mentioned, a private cloud has a lot of value, especially for certain use cases, but it takes quite a bit of effort and time to build that up. And if you do that right from the get-go, you may not be that experienced with cloud yet. You may be making decisions based on not a lot of knowledge. If you try out some applications that can be suited for the public cloud first, you're going to learn a lot more about cloud. You're going to get a lot more experience with how to run your applications, what are the things you need to consider, and then you can take that into account as you're building out your private cloud and trying to get that up and running. Leverage the strength of cloud. Think about the value it provides. How is it different than what you're doing? Don't try to just take everything in your data center and do it exactly the same in cloud. Be willing to consider new approaches. And then measure success based on the big business goals. So don't get too caught up in every little detail, but think about, are my goals agility, efficiency, better solutions? Does this enable it? Did cloud get there? If not, what could I do differently that would maybe enable cloud to provide those benefits to me? So let's go ahead now and take some questions. While we're doing that, I'll just put this up on the screen. If you're thinking about a cloud POC, we have a free offering at RightScale that's called a cloud strategy briefing. And what this is a personalized briefing from cloud experts on our team. So these are people that have worked with hundreds and hundreds of customers to help them architect, deploy, get cloud applications up and running, help them scale successfully. And we've been doing this over the past 6-7 years. So the personalized briefing is a briefing with your IT execs, managers, your business team, whoever that might be. We talk about cloud trends, what's kind of the latest and greatest, what are people doing in the cloud today, strategic opportunities, how are people getting benefit, technical issues to think about, some of the ones we talked about today, but in a little more depth, as well as some of the topics we talked about today for cloud POCs. So if you guys are thinking about doing that, please feel free to contact us. The number, or you can email us at sales@RightScale. Ask for a cloud strategy briefing, and we'll get something scheduled for you. So with that, let's go ahead and let's take some questions that we've had come in. So the first question that I have is for VJ. And the question, VJ, is it feasible to move an existing application to the cloud, or do I have to start with a new application so that I can make sure it's a good fit for the cloud?
Thanks, Kim. That's a great question. We talked a little bit earlier about choosing the right applications for your cloud POC. And with that, I would encourage you that when you're going through this evaluation and you're looking at which applications are a good fit for this POC, if you have the opportunity to deploy a greenfield application, that's always the best place to start. And the reason that's the best place to start is a couple of things. First of all, it's a net new application. So if you go through this POC and you find that it's successful, and guess what? You just accomplished a real project. And now you can go ahead and cross that off the list rather than just going through and performing a science project and finding out if the cloud is actually going to work for this environment. Second of all, you don't really have those preconceived notions of what's required to run this application. You can start out with that net new application and say, hey, guess what? The cloud's a great fit for this without having this expectation of this is how I do it already today. You can think about it in that new paradigm right from the get-go. That being said, if you don't have a greenfield application or you have existing workloads, you can absolutely move those over to cloud architecture. It oftentimes just requires a little bit more thought and going through the architectural discussion of how you'll do that. So there's a little bit more work involved, but it's definitely something that can be done.
Great, thanks, VJ. So another question that we had come in is, how does RightScale fit into the stack, and what does it provide above what the cloud vendors offer?
Sure. So RightScale is really providing you with a management tool for provisioning your applications to cloud infrastructure, both public and private. What we really focus on is giving you a set of tools to take cloud infrastructure and operationalize it within your organization. So things like tying your application architecture into that underlying cloud infrastructure, giving you a level of automation to take advantage of the tools that the cloud provides and really build it into a highly available and scalable architecture to fit the needs of your application. We also focus on giving you tools to help interface with existing systems or existing processes you may have. So for example, you have a security team that currently defines all of your security policy, and give them the tools to define your security policy in the cloud. You have a system administration team that really defines the architectures that can be used within your environment, and we allow them to take that process and build it into the cloud of actually not only defining those architectures, but automating those processes and making them available in a self-service fashion. So now when you have a developer or a line of business owner that comes to you with a set of requirements, they can now deploy their applications onto cloud infrastructure, but they know that they're going to meet the security and compliance requirements within your organization because they're leveraging the architectures built by both your system administration and your security team.
All right, great. And we have a few more specific questions. So one is, what's involved in migrating Linux batch processing applications that require large data sets to the cloud? And also, while you're doing that, ensure data security.
Sure. So there's a couple of things when it comes to batch processing. First of all, the most apparent thing, or the most apparent requirement that you'll see when you're deploying a batch processing workload to the cloud is really the need for some level of a queuing service. And this is what's going to allow you to actually go and spawn off that sort of a parallel workload. Oftentimes, we'll see cloud providers themselves offer a queuing service, or we'll leverage technologies like a RabbitMQ or an ActiveMQ to really build those queues and spawn off those necessary processes in parallel to actually achieve that sort of a batch processing environment. In regards to data security, we will often leverage technologies from our independent software vendor partners to leverage things like disk encryption as well as VPNs for encrypting data both in transit and at rest.
Okay, that's great. And we have another question. Does RightScale support moving workloads between different clouds, like from AWS to an on-premise or vice versa?
Yeah, we absolutely do. We talked a little bit earlier about how RightScale provides you this automation framework to help operationalize cloud within your organization. The other piece of RightScale is it's really acting as an abstraction layer so that when you go and you start deploying these applications, if you don't necessarily know what cloud is going to be the best fit, or the requirements change over time as we start adding more and more cloud providers and more players enter the industry, RightScale acts as that abstraction layer, keeping your applications portable so you can move them to the appropriate clouds over time, whether those be public or private.
Okay, great. And what would you say is the biggest bottleneck for those looking to put apps and services in the cloud? Is it security and compliance considerations, architecture considerations?
Sure. In all honesty, the biggest challenge that we see with cloud environments and with enterprises looking to adopt cloud is really the fact that it is a little bit of a new paradigm. And people often just get caught up in the fact that, hey, we've been doing things the same way for a while. I just assume that I'll do the same thing in the cloud. And that really is the biggest challenge that we see. It's really more of a methodology and a thought process challenge. When we look at actual technological challenges, those are often easier to accomplish. The biggest challenge from a performance perspective is certainly on the storage side. We talked about that a little bit earlier and how we can help get around those sorts of requirements with things like leveraging technologies like sharding and NoSQL at the database tier specifically. In regards to security and compliance, oftentimes that's a lot less of a challenge than you might think. It's somewhat of a misnomer that you can't actually run a PCI compliant architecture out in a public cloud. And most of the time when we go through these applications, we find that we actually can. It just requires a different set of tools and a little bit of a different approach than we may have used inside of our own data centers.
That's a good point. Also mentioned that we call him our security guy, Phil Cox here at RightScale, who's an expert in security. He's been a security analyst in the past and also does all of our internal security at RightScale. Has written a blog specifically about how to be PCI compliant in the cloud. So if you're interested in that topic, feel free to go to our blog. I'm going to have time for probably a couple more questions. So if you have any last questions you want to get in, please send them our way. And the next one I have for you, VJ, is what have been some examples of the types of applications that people have used to get started in the cloud?
Sure. So really the applications that we've seen deploy out in the cloud have been really across the board in terms of what's possible. We've seen everything from a three-tier auto-scaling LAMP stack running a web application to social games to mobile applications, all the way up to an Oracle Enterprise Suite for your ERP system running out in the cloud. So we've really seen the gamut of applications. That being said, when you're starting out with your POCs, we highly recommend you start with something that's very lightweight. Oftentimes, when we're leveraging these sorts of cloud architectures, an application that's public-facing is a very good place to start. If you have a web app, I'm yet to see an organization that doesn't have some level of a web application that's leveraging, open source technologies. Those tend to be very, very good fits because they fit well into cloud architectures. They often don't have the licensing challenges or the security and compliance challenges of, say, your, ERP system. It's a good place to get started, get your feet wet, and that really tends to be where we see most people start with that sort of a web app, and then they start migrating into more of their heavyweight enterprise applications.
Okay, great. Well, with that, we're just a couple minutes from the end of our hour, so I want to respect everybody's time. I'll turn it back over to Sarah to wrap us up, and she'll tell you about where you can get slides and the content from the webinar.
Great. Thanks, Kim, and thanks, Vijay, and thanks everyone for joining us today for this webinar. So this webinar has been recorded. We just need to do a little transcoding after this wraps up, and we'll post it on our site later this afternoon. And we will be emailing everyone who's attended with that link and sending that out tomorrow morning. Thanks again for joining us. Thanks again, Kim and Vijay, and have a wonderful rest of your day.